The GPS DairyCAST features the high-value insights of the GPS Dairy Consulting team's trusted advisors and the owners and managers from the elite dairy farms they serve. These conversations deliver on the GPS Dairy Consulting promise to inspire change and grow leaders.
Well, hello and welcome to the GPS DairyCAST. I'm Peggy Coffeen from the Up-Level Dairy Podcast, serving as your host. And on this GPS DairyCAST, we are with three members of the GPS Dairy Consulting team. Go ahead and say hello, Andre, Paul, and Nathan.
Hello, thanks for having us.
Hi, this is Paul. Nice to be here.
Nathan here. Thanks for having us today.
We're the same ones that we had a conversation a few episodes back about FeedFIT assessments. And so this is really part 2 of that conversation. In conversation 1, you can go back a couple episodes and you can hear from Paul Dyk, Andre Pereira, and Nathan Pokowski as they talked about FeedFIT assessments from the TMR side and the TMR auditing side. But today we're taking a little bit different approach, and we're really looking at the work that you do in the barns for your dairy clients through GPS Dairy Consulting. And so, gentlemen, just walk us through a little bit of this part 2 of FeedFIT assessments in the barn. What is the work that you're doing in the feed alleys, in the barn? What does that look like?
So, we mix the feed first, and we always talk about there's, many different diets. We put one together on paper. Then we mix one and then we put it in front of the cow. And first discussion we talked about the mixer and the piece of paper, right, and making sure that you line up. And then we deliver the feed in front of the cow. And so now we put cameras up in the barn to look to see, are we getting the proper feed delivered in front of the cow at the right. And then while we're looking at that, on the cows when they're and then we'll catch things like when they're coming back from the parlors. So these are all important things. We're focusing on a TMR, but there's also so many other things that come along that be problematic if hit right. Cows are creatures of habit. We have to make sure that we hit them at their right times, right?
And this is really the value of this kind of a holistic view from outside eyes at the TMR audit process through your FeedFIT assessment. Is you're looking for one, what's going on outside and what's going on with the ration and what's going into that ration and what's getting delivered. And now you're really looking at the functionality in the barn of what's going on. And it's more than just the feed. It's the mechanisms and the processes and the systems that are being employed around that can lead to success or potentially lead to some other challenges. And so, Andre, for you, do you approach a FeedFIT assessment from the barn side similar to Nathan, or do you do something a little bit different on your end?
I do pretty much the same aspects that Nathan talked about, and those are very important. I also like to look at cow behavior and how the cows are behaving in the barn as well, how they're walking around, if they have a preferred area to be. So I try to mark a cow. She may have some marking on the back or some specific color, and I might mark her and I try to see on the video, okay, where is she going? How is she moving here? And try to look at behaviors too, laying down times. Are they fighting to lay down? Are they comfortable? Do they like to do that? Are they comfortable drinking water? So there are other aspects of cow behavior that I also like to see when I put these cameras up.
What we're hearing here is, Andre, you're pulling out some of that behavioral aspects that you're able to gather from camera data. Nathan, you talked about looking at lockup times, especially during fresh checks, things like that. And when cows are coming back in from milking, feed delivery, of course, huge. Paul, is there anything else that you add to your spin when you're doing feed assessment from the barn side?
Yeah, there's a lot of people that use cameras in the industry, and it's how you use them and what you do with that data. I like to put, a lot of times if I got a big pen, I like to have 2 cameras on. One thing I've found that when you look at whether you can see cows have feed from one end of the bunk to the other is perspective. Cameras, a lot of times you think you can see like halfway down the bunk, but you really can only see like 25%. So I like to have a couple cameras if I got a key group that I'm looking at. So I do look at how is feed distributed evenly when it's fed? Is one end of the bunk running out of feed versus the other end? I like to see, obviously, how often push-ups happen. We want to make sure cows aren't reaching for feed. And it's kind of funny. You would always think that, well, that must be at the end of the day. But sometimes it's almost in that 3-hour period right after that first feeding. You all of a sudden have these cows, and some of them are eating a little bit more, and they almost need like that first push-up within 45 minutes or an hour, just because they're kind of filling up that first round. Not that you want that all the time, but just making sure they don't run out of feed. So for me, using cameras is a lot about just trying to understand what's really happening. You could capture things with software like timing of feeding, but push-ups are more difficult to see how often those happen. How feed is distributed is very difficult to see in any other way. So I like cameras just to get an idea of what's really happening when I'm not there. And part of that is you can't just set up cameras for one day. I have found that you really need to have them set up for a week. And yeah, that takes a little bit of time to go watch them. You better figure out how to look at those in a fast way, high speed, 3x, 2x, and how you have your camera set. But it's funny how guys, when they know the cameras are up there, they can do a great job of push-ups and feed distribution for a day or two. But then when you do it for almost for a week, you start to capture those weekend feeders, what's happening at night. And if somebody's trying to outsmart the cameras, it's hard to outsmart a camera for a week. I mean, if they keep pushing up for a week because they know the camera's there, you've just created a habit. So actually we solve the problem without actually knowing if there is one. But it is kind of one of those things. It's a fair bit of work if you do it right, but periodically it can really kind of enhance those feeders and really your feed management on the dairy.
So I got to divert over to Nathan, because those that are able to watch this in the video version, they may have noticed what I picked up on. That was Nathan smiling during some of the things that Paul was talking about. So Nathan, I'm guessing that there are some things that Paul was saying about monitoring feeders that must resonate with you. What have you uncovered and discovered in the process of reviewing some of that data when you've had cameras up for a week in the barn?
It's funny because Paul mentioned the point about the first 2 days are always rock solid. Like, I'll find out guys are pushing feet up every half hour, and I'm like, oh, this is great. And then the third day comes along, and now we're back to 2, then we slip to 3, and then all of a sudden it's 4, and you start to see what is actually the trend of what's actually going on. And then you can come back, and without the camera, without the pictures, it's really hard to go to somebody and say, well, cows are off in production, feed's probably not being pushed up. We're seeing these ups and downs with components or something funky that's going on. And you can always go and say, hey, this is what I think. But when you bring the camera, you bring the footage and you show, then it's an educational piece. Now you're educating somebody on what's going on and explaining the why to them, because you have, here's the problem, here's what's happening in the barn, and this is what's happening performance-wise to the animals. We're talking a lot about push-ups and that, but you'll see how people are moving cows too. How they're doing the work in the barn. And when I have cameras up, they'll be over a water, so I'll be able to look at water levels and, oh, well, that water has been empty for however long. I mean, it just happens. You pick up on these little things when you're looking at it over a week period. So in the wintertime, yeah, obviously we're not going to see water maybe as much as we would in the summer, but yeah. So I think, Andre, you could probably say the same thing, right?
Just to chime in one point before we get to Andre, is that I think we use cameras not to point out to feeders or the herd team, hey, you're doing something wrong. It's always about getting better. Hey, how do we make this team go from average to excellent to world class? We want to bring our feeders to the next level, bring our herd team to the next level. And the cameras are there not to point out problems, but point out areas of improvement. Andre?
And Paul, that's pretty much exactly what I really like to do, is go talk to the crew as well, right? And sometimes I have to go talk to them in Spanish as well, which is important to make them understand we're not here to put a camera on you and tell you what you're doing wrong and make your life miserable. It's on the contrary. We're trying to find efficiencies. We're trying to find what can be improved. What can we do better here that's going to make their lives easier and it's going to make the cows look better as well. And sometimes a lot of times it's just not their fault that things are not going as well as they should be, right? So a good conversation, when I put the cameras up, I always go around the barn and I try to talk to everybody that's working there and say, here, this is why I have the camera up. We're just trying to work, trying to find the efficiencies, trying to find the little things we want to change. And like you said, Paul, sometimes the problem would just fix itself just by having the camera there. It's crazy just because they think, you know what, I should do a better job here. They're trying to help me there, but I'll just get it done.
Yeah, I said education, and I just wanted to touch on that. I usually, my strategy around this whole idea is when I'm going to put cameras up, I'll have a discussion with the whole team. And just like you said, Andre, hey, these are up to look for areas of improvement. Where can we get that next tenth of butterfat, next pound of milk off of improving the management system without spending anything on feed or just by getting better? And then having a discussion with them before you're showing them the pictures and making sure that, hey, this is not a finger point at you moment. This is how do we get better?
Yeah, I think it's about accountability as well between different feeders and people on different teams. Like the weekend feeders, they don't always get all the full training, right? They don't hear everybody talking to them. But then when all of a sudden you come back to your regular feeder and your regular guys on the weekdays, you go, hey, these guys on the weekends, they're 15% of your team. And if they're not doing something quite right, you need to encourage them. You need to help them. They're part of your team. Everybody's part of the success. So I like your guys' concepts really of, hey, we approach this as a team, and it's not just about telling the manager or the owner, hey, these guys are doing a bad job, because then you're going to really miss the mark and it's not going to be successful. But when you bring those guys along and say, hey, here's what I'm seeing, what can we do better? Why isn't that getting pushed up? Sometimes it's because it's a shift change, or hey, we didn't even know no push-ups were happening at 2 a.m. because we thought it was his responsibility. So I love the idea of bringing those guys together and saying, all right, we have a problem. How can we solve them? And let them solve the problem if possible.
So you've talked about the process of having the cameras and reviewing that data and bringing it to the team, but there's actually a very specific step in the FeedFIT assessment, and it's a feeding data review. Nathan, do you want to tell us a little bit more about what that is and what it means to the producer?
Yeah, it's a feeding data review, or for short, we would call it an FDR. And one of our colleagues in-house, Aaron, puts it together for us. And what it is it collects all the data from the feeding software program. And from there, we can go through it and we can look at, okay, what are the deviations when we're loading feed? Are we really high or really low on an ingredient? What are the cows being fed? Are they being fed 10 minutes early, 10 minutes late? And then there's some other aspects to it, but that ties into the cameras, because we can look at the cameras and go, okay, we're seeing it on the feeding program that the cows are being fed earlier, they're being fed late, or we're not seeing it on the feeding program, but we can kind of link those two together to help solve that problem. And then there'll be things like intakes and dry matter changes and other data pieces on there, things obviously that we can't see from the dry matter updates we can't see from the cameras, obviously, but intakes we certainly can, and we can see that, hey, cows are running out of feed, and we are seeing this on the camera. It's another piece, but it's like I said earlier, we can show the FDR, but it really works well when we can show the FDR with some camera footage. It just links the two together. So Paul or Andre, you guys want to touch in on some other points there?
Yeah, one of the things that I like to do is we, of course, like to combine the visual and the data. The FDR is very data-driven. It's very data-driven off of the software and saying, okay, we know that these cows, according to what we see in the data, are running out of feed 4 times a month, or 6 days out of the month, they're less than 1% refusals. Is that what we want for those high groups? And it also helps us key in on those groups. And okay, these groups here, this group 1 is always running out of feed. Why is that? Well, maybe it's they're moving cows in and out, but it gives us direction. And it also, for those learners that like data versus visual, it'll give them some more numbers to drive from. Some people like data, some people like visual. So we like to make that combo to really have an impact on the dairies.
There are a couple of things I like to look at the FDR, for example, is accuracy. So I like to look at the accuracies of feed ingredients, if there is any errors in loading feed. Maybe they're dumping a few pounds more mineral that they should be just because it's easier for them to do it, but then it's too much mineral for the cows. Also looking at how much they're fighting against themselves every day on the amounts being fed in the bunk. So let's say if you're off by an hour between one day and another, feeding and you're always off by an hour or 30 minutes between days, you're actually fighting with yourself on the buck. The buck might be clean. You say, oh, I'm going to feed more. But then the next day, you're going to feed 1 hour early. Well, the buck's going to be more full. So the feeder is going to say, well, the buck is full. I'm going to feed less. So now that's just a snowball that keeps happening. And we can actually match those numbers and that data with what we see in the camera. And that's where, like Paul said, it's a data and a visual combination that's where this whole process shines.
Yeah, and again, it's about going through that data, even though it's some tables and charts, and saying to the feeders, hey, what happened those days? Like if all of a sudden there's 3 or 4 days where the data's all messed up, and hey, why do we have no cows being fed on 2 days a month? Well, we know that's not real. They got fed. Well, the mixer broke down, or yeah, we didn't put refusals in because employee B, he never puts the refusals into the computer. He always forgets. It becomes, how can we improve that? If there's a problem, and we do see this on some dairies where, hey, yeah, the mixer breaks down. It's about 3 times a month where all of a sudden there's something wrong. There's a problem with the mixer. Well, the weigh scales were wrong that day. Well, that happened last month. Well, maybe we need a new mixer, or maybe we need to have a repair schedule. Maybe we need to have a maintenance schedule so that we don't have these issues. How are we maintaining that mixer? But again, I find the questions to the feeders are always helpful, rather than saying, hey, you did something wrong here. I think you guys are really messing up here. It's about, hey, tell me what happened those days. Oh, it rained. And remember that day? It was raining buckets. We had 6 inches of rain that day. And yeah, we didn't know how to adjust the dry matters. And yep, the cows ran out of feed that next day. And it took us 3 days to get that back. Well, what can we do next time to fix that? And having that discussion and saying, all right, well, maybe next time when this happens, let's try this, because whatever you did last time, it didn't work. So talking to them and letting them give you answers, it's so much more helpful than just saying, hey, you're really screwing up. It's about having a discussion with them.
You learn their process too, right, Paul? Like their process becomes day in and day out of doing one thing, and it works sometimes, but there's a handful of times where it doesn't work, and they haven't been talked to about it or shown or educated. And by doing this, like Paul was saying, we can help fix those processes, because they think that, oh, well, this is the best way to do it. Well, it might be, but let's just alter it a little bit to make it a little bit better.
Make your feed center a profit center. FeedFIT is an innovative, module-based, and collaborative initiative from GPS Dairy Consulting, which provides the framework and resources to understand the financials, trace the inventories, and track the KPIs of your feed center. By implementing the expertise of your GPS consultant, modules are strategically executed with the goal of continual improvement in the efficiency of your feed center. Take the science of nutrition to the reality of milk in the tank with FeedFIT. To learn more, ask your GPS Dairy consultant or look under the Education tab at gpsdairy.com.
So the 3 of you have had some pretty in-depth experiences with doing the FeedFIT assessments, and you shared some of the findings that you have uncovered, some of these different experiences of working with feeders and of bringing that information forward, and even the methods through which you do it that lead to successful changes and increased performance of the team, and that leads to increased performance of the cows as well. But I'm going to challenge you for a minute to really think about some of the success stories, some specific stories that each of you could share. If you could each just share one. And what we're looking for here, sometimes it's that big win that you can grab onto. And sometimes it's those little wins that are what adds up to make the difference at the end of the day that help that dairy achieve its goals. A dairy that is doing it really well, and you're looking for that good to great step. So let's hear it. What are some of those stories and some of the results where you've been able to see either some big wins or perhaps some of those really small wins that do add up to make a big difference?
For me, a lot of the times it tends to be a handful of small wins that turn into a big one. You're working on better push-ups, or you're working at making sure that cows aren't coming back from the parlor without feed, when we thought that they were for sure coming back and had feed in front of them, but found out that there was actually a half an hour there that they didn't have feed. And so I've experienced that a handful of different times on farms. And here just recently, I've found that through the summer this year, I shouldn't say a handful of farms, but there's a few farms there that the guys weren't taking cows up quick enough on intake. Feeders were just inching them up, inching them up, inching them up. And that harms production when the cows are coming back in cooler temperatures. And so what I explained is that we need to be more aggressive as we go into cooler temperatures and get intakes back up. Maybe this high cow group was eating 63 pounds and they dropped down to 60 pounds of dry matter, or maybe it went all the way down to 58 just because heat abatement wasn't as great. Take them up to 62, 63 right away when the temperatures get cooler. Okay, we have to clean some feed up, but then our cows aren't out of feed. And making sure that we always have feed in front of them is important because they're going to come back. Maybe be 2 or 3 days, but they will eventually come back up there.
Nathan, that's a great story to share. And let me challenge you back with this question too. Had you not done the work of having the camera data and being able to pull out the numbers to match it up, and then following that up with the observations and the conversations, do you think that this dairy would have got to the same resolutions had you not taken those steps through this part of the FeedFIT assessment?
I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier about process, right? Feeders get stuck in this process, and this is how they do things over time. And if we don't take the right steps to go through that process and really critique that process, maybe they would get there, but how long does it take them to get there? I think that's the question. How long are they gonna, is it 1 year, 2 year that they just continue down this road, or 2 months, whatever, until somebody looks into it and figures it out? I mean, these things seem so simple, but yet they're a huge piece of the picture. So I would say that some dairies may struggle with it for a long time. There may be other dairies that get there a little bit quicker, but by doing this, and this is a big part of why we do this, is to make sure that we're fixing these things as soon as we can to make sure that we're getting these dairies at this high level of performance. And not all the time milk production either. It all comes back to milk production, but cow health too. Dry cows running out of feed or fresh cows running out of feed, and then we're dealing with metritis or ketosis, RPs, the list goes on and on.
Well, thanks for sharing that story, Nathan, and digging into that a little bit. Paul, how about you? What's a success story or some big or small wins that you've experienced out on the farm?
Yeah, so I'm thinking about a dairy, and we had a few fresh cow problems like Nathan was alluding to. If you look at that data, you would say, hey, those cows are getting fed the exact same time every day, 5:08 a.m., 5:10 a.m. And that data would tell you that these cows are getting fed on time every day and getting feed pushed up. But what we started looking at was when they were taking that feed up, when they were taking away the refusals. My goal on most dairies is, especially for fresh cows, I don't want them to be out of feed for more than 15 minutes in a day. And on lactating groups, maybe half an hour, but again, the goal of 15 minutes. When we started looking at this dairy, it wasn't that they weren't getting fed on time, but they kept moving it back in terms of when they were picking up the feed. Not only did they do this on the fresh groups, but they also did this on the lactating groups, where they would come in and go, they have somebody new and the guys, hey, we're picking up feed in this group half an hour, and let's work ahead. We can get ahead of the game, and like we're going to get 2 loads ahead. And all of a sudden you got some groups that are out of feed for an hour, hour and a quarter, because the guy who's picking up the refusal, he thinks he's doing a great job. I'm ahead of the game. I'm going to make sure the feed is all gone so that when the guy comes and feed, we're ready to go. Well, what happens is, yeah, the cows are fed on time, but they've been out of feed for an hour, hour and a half, because somebody was working ahead too far. So it's really coming back to them and saying, hey, those fresh cows, you can't pick up feed until you're ready to feed the cows. Like the guy can't be more than 20 minutes ahead of you, whoever's picking up the feed, if it's a different guy. So that means, hey, do you have texts? Do you have phones? Hey, I'm going to be feeding at 5:08. You can't pick up that feed till like 10 to 5. Okay, you just can't do it. And on those other groups, I know you're ahead of the game. Well, we need to figure out what else you can do, but you can't be picking up feed an hour and a half early, especially on big dairies where there's 20 or 25 pens. You would think, well, with smaller dairies with only 6 or 8 pens, it's not that big of a deal. But when they start to have 20 pens or so, it's easy to get ahead of the game and start picking up feed too early, and cows running out of feed. It's another way to get the cows run out of feed. And you don't get that without actually looking or being there in the morning or having actually cameras set up. So it's kind of that fun combination of data plus visual. And for that dairy, once you start feeding those cows on time, they don't have any run out of feed, the fresh cow problems go away. For me, that's a big success story because we solved the problem, and it wasn't because somebody was mixing wrong, they weren't feeding wrong. There was another little part of that puzzle that wasn't getting done quite right.
Great story to share, Paul. And it also really alludes to the broader picture approach of not just looking at what's going on with the feed and with that part of the system, but looking at the full implementation all the way to its delivery and timing in front of the cow, and then being able to pull all of those pieces together through the FeedFIT assessment and what it offers. And Andre, as we wrap up here in our last few minutes, what's your story to share?
Mine was a very simple one, but it had a really high economical return. Is on butterfat. It was this farmer trying to just bring the butterfat up and I was working really hard on the diet, trying to bring that fat up, and it just would not go up as I would expect or compared to other dairies where I had a similar type of diet, but the cows were just not doing that. So looking at the cameras, we were looking at actually push-up time. So they had the robot push-uppers, right? Those little robots that go up and down, and they're on a timer, and they actually do a great job at pushing up on time because they are on a timer automatically. But what we found out is that for the first and second push, where the feed gets dropped and then you go and push up the feed with the robot, they just didn't have the power, or they were not matched to the capacity of the amount of feed that was there. So the feed wasn't being pushed up correctly. So you could see that the cows still did not have access to that feed even after that first drop. And the first push-up done with a tractor on that bunk was actually 4 to 5 hours after the first feed drop. So they thought that the robot would have the capacity to actually push up the feed and make the cows come back and eat better. But we just found out that was not the case. So what we did was we moved the push-up with the tractor to 1 hour after first drop, and then do it again at 2 hours after first drop, and then let the robot run after that. And that actually did a huge improvement. We got some butterfat in the milk, good responses there. And you just can see on the behavior side as well how the cows would actually come back to that tractor push-up better than they were with the robot. They pretty much knew that the robot wasn't pushing enough feed there. I'm not saying that the robot is bad or anything. It's just it wasn't measured to the capacity of the amount of feed that was there.
And Andre, as you shared this story, and we lay it next to Paul and Nathan's experiences of taking the FeedFIT assessment, this really full circle approach to the dairy from the feed pad right to the barn, one thing that really stands out about the stories you've shared is that this assessment and the results that are able to be driven from it can apply to so many different scenarios, whether it's a system where there's tractor push-up and robotic push-up, one, the other, or both, or as Paul had alluded to before, different size dairies with multiple pens or just a few pens. And what it really says is that the value you're able to drive with your GPS consulting team through being hands-on as well as eyes-on through cameras and through your visual observations, and tying that together with data and being able to really present it for enhanced performance. These are the things that really do make a difference at the end of the day. And so as we wrap up this conversation of part 2 of FeedFIT assessment, anything else you guys would like to share?
I think I always tell people when I put cameras up, I'm gonna find something. There's gonna be something that I'm gonna find. And that's part of how I bring people in. Hey, this is an educational thing. We've talked about it, but we'll always find something, and it's how we bring it back with the multiple sources that we have to educate the team on. So I'll leave you guys with that.
Make sure you never stop improving. That's always my goal, is to always improve, always be better, always work on yourself, work on your farm, work on your business. And that's the idea of working on this.
Yeah, world class comes to mind. We don't want our feeders and our feed management system to be average. What's world class? And are you sure you're there? Because we want to make sure that you're meeting the benchmarks, not only of your farm, but compared to other dairies. There's always one step more. There's always one step more. We can get better.
All right. Well, speaking of world class, thank you to this trio for joining us today here on the GPS DairyCast. Paul Dyk, Andre Pereira, Nathan Pokowski, and I'm Peggy Coffeen from the Uplevel Dairy Podcast, your host for this GPS DairyCast. Thanks for listening, and make sure you tune back in a couple episodes back to hear part 1 on FeedFIT assessments from these 3, and make sure you join us again for our next episode.
The GPS DairyCast features conversations that deliver on the GPS Dairy Consulting promise to inspire change and grow leaders. If this GPS DairyCast has you looking for more ways to become an elite dairy producer, find more information in our show notes on how you can add a GPS advisor to your team.